From the hills of West Virginia to the high rises of Chicago. For over 30 years, Dan Frio has mastered the real estate market as one of the country's premier mortgage advisors. Dan is now sharing his experience and knowledge with the AM 560 audience. So sit back and learn how Dan has helped his clients manage the ups and downs of the real estate market across the country. Now, here's the host of the Mortgage Update, Dan Frio.
Welcome to the Mortgage Update with Dan Frio, and I, of course, am Dan Frio. Today we have a special guest. As I promised, I asked Steve Cortez to be a guest on the show, and he said yes. And so welcome, Steve. Thanks for coming on. Greatly appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Steve's on every night on WIND radio from 5 to 7. And I listen to him every night, and he has great insight. And the reason why I asked him to be on the show, we had lunch a couple weeks ago, and I learned a lot about him. He was a trader on Wall Street. He's on Fox all the time. He has the ear of Donald Trump. But where I first heard you or saw you was every week you would be on some kind of left-wing radio, just people just pounding you. And I'm like, what is this guy doing? You know, why do you put yourself through this every week after week after week? And then you gave me some insight that you were kind of asked by Trump to do this. So, right. Welcome, Steve.
I appreciate it. Yes, no, I'm not just a sadomasochist. I don't look for torturous situations. Yeah. But I do think it's important. You know, look, let's face it. Most media out there, most corporate media, leans heavily left. Oh, yeah. There's very little real journalism in this country. And I think it's important for those of us who are believers in the America First movement, those of us who are supporters of President Trump, it's important for us to not just completely ignore those media outlets. So I went into the lion's den very often. I worked for CNN for 2 years. As you can imagine, every TV hit was a scrum. I mean, I always felt like I was stepping into the political version of the octagon. Yeah. But I think it was important. And I hope that there were viewers out there, maybe not the majority, but I hope there was a portion of CNN viewers who were willing to at least consider what I had to say regarding our philosophy.
Well, and the nice thing about on your show every night, you always have somebody. The other night you had a gentleman on there. He actually did a really good job pleading the case of, you know, the left side of the equation. Mm-hmm. And he had some great content. But the nice thing is you guys don't sit there and scream at each other. You have a cordial conversation, like you said. Let's just you're not, if you can turn 1% of the people, you know, maybe, or at least just give your facts behind everything. The tough thing is when you don't hear the facts. You just hear the rhetoric of they just scream back and forth, and it's like, guys, can you answer the question?
Right.
That's
I think that's so important, and I'm really trying to do that on the Steve Cortez show every night. I do have a lot of liberal guests on. I have a lot of folks who do not care for the president or his agenda, and I want to have good debates and discussions because I think the food fight that we see too often, that I've been a part of. I mean, I don't set it up that way, but I've been a participant, an unwilling participant in some ways in a lot of those food fights on cable news. I don't think it makes anybody smarter. I don't think it makes our country better. Right. So I'm trying to do it a different way.
Here's what I always say with some of this stuff. You know, I'm all for the First Amendment. Where I think there's a fine line is when the First Amendment, I'm sure, wasn't for those to go on TV. You know, it wasn't even at the time, but the news or the journalists to come out there and spread, I'll just say it, lies. Sure. You know, I'm sure the content was supposed to be, you're giving the truth. Okay, I'm for the First Amendment. But if you're just going to spread rhetoric and lies out there, right. And I mean, when they're pure lies, there might be a judgment call, but a lie is a lie. I mean, when it's just
no. And Dan, you listen. I think it's an important point. By the way, I'm very glad that the Covington kids, that Nick Sandmann in particular, that he sued CNN. Yeah. We don't know the terms of his settlement, but CNN settled with him, probably a very generous financial amount. I think we need to see more of that kind of litigation. I don't generally love litigation. I've pursued anyone in my life. I hope I never have to. Yeah. However, I do think that, unfortunately, media, it's been too difficult, I think, in our country to sue media outlets for slander or libel. And I think that I hope we see more actions like what the Covington kids did, because they were absolutely smeared and wronged. Yeah. And there's more suits. By the way, he filed suits against a lot of folks. He's only settled that one. More are continuing. But I think that'd be a good thing for our country, because to your point, just because somebody has the freedom to go out and say what they want doesn't mean that they should be consequence-free if they tell a lie about you, a demonstrable lie.
Yeah. All right. So the reason why I had you on here is I wanted to get you had one show in particular that talked about the housing, the economy, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I actually called in, and you were grateful enough to take the call, and it was just a little segment. But I wanted to get your take on, you have a lot of experience on the economic side. You know Wall Street. You also know the government piece of things. I wanted your intake on, what do you think the economy, the true facts behind it? Because you watch one side of the channels and the world is ending. Then you watch the other side of the channels and it's, euphoria. So what's the facts? What is your take on the economy right now?
Sure. Well, listen, I think the economy is incredibly strong. And by the way, to some degree, don't just take my word for it. Let's listen to, for example, small business owners. So CNBC does a quarterly survey of small business owners. 64% of them approve of Donald Trump's handling of his presidency, which is a new record high for small business owners. So the entrepreneurs out there, the American strivers, the creators, the job providers, they are overwhelmingly incredibly optimistic about this economy right now. And almost every survey of sentiment, whether it's consumer sentiment, small business, big business, you name it, all of them, they're either at all-time highs or they're at high levels that we haven't seen, Dan, since the 1990s. So there's an optimism in the land that is really palpable and real. And specifically regarding housing, I think this is so crucial. We're starting to see the housing market now in terms of some of the great data that's coming out. For example, building permits, which just came out this week. We had a 13-year high level on building permits that we hadn't seen since 2007. What's really fantastic about that, I'm somebody who's traded mortgages and interest rates for a quarter century before I went full-time into politics now. And what's really different and better about the housing boom right now is that it's not built on nonsense. It's not built on liar loans and leverage. That 2000 number, the last time we saw building permits this high, that was built on quicksand. That was built on a lot of nonsense and dishonesty. And we know, of course, how it ended. It practically sank the world into a global depression. Now, if anything, it's difficult to get a mortgage. Anybody who's done it lately knows that. I mean, the documentation is provided. There's no more liar loans. There's no more, put nothing down and sign your name and walk away with a condo. That doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. So this is real now, is my point. So it's real. It's better. It's substantive. And what I'm just so excited about is that Americans believe again. We really needed that. We need to believe that we can grow because it can become a virtuous cycle upward. Belief begets belief, which begets investment and hiring and spending. And right now we're seeing that virtuous cycle really work in the American economy.
Yeah, when you had that segment, the reason why I called is like you hit everything. Most of the time when you talk to somebody about the housing market, they'll know bits and pieces of things. And when you start saying, the mortgages were just too easy, the liar loans, the documentation loans, I was like, hey, he gets it. I've done this since 1988, so I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and the terrible. Where do you see? So the housing market, the building permits are kicking right now. What's your prediction on interest rates? Where do you see the Fed going? Where do you see, because of what they follow with manufacturing, the PPI and everything? What do you think? What do you see in there?
I think interest rates are going to stay low, and I wish I didn't have that prediction, quite honestly, because it would be good for our country if interest rates would rise. Not dramatically, but if they would start to tick up. It would be good for savers in this country. It would be a good sign for the economy. Unfortunately, here's the reason. As optimistic as I am on the American economy, the reason I don't think we're going to see a material move higher in interest rates is the global economy, because as good as things are here in the United States, they're awful in most of the world. We just got a lot of data out of Europe, for example, that shows the German industrial economy is back into contraction. It's actually in a recession. I think a lot of Europe is likely in recession. China was slowing dramatically even before the coronavirus. Coronavirus risks now have greatly exacerbated the situation in China, which again was already deteriorating and slowing before the virus. So unfortunately, the U.S. in a lot of ways, unfortunately for us, we are an island of growth. We're really an oasis of optimism and innovation. However, given the global scenario, it's my view that interest rates are going to stay very, very low because global deflationary pressures are still meaning pushing prices down, pricing power down. On a global level, I think is still going to be the persistent theme. Now, that's also, though, look, as I said, it would be good for our country in some ways for interest rates to rise, not quickly, but a slow rise would be a good thing. On the other hand, there are, of course, benefits to low rates, and housing being absolutely one of them, making housing affordable, particularly for first-time home buyers.
Right. I never understood until probably a decade ago why everybody was so focused on house permits, house building. And then, my eyes were open that there's so many components of the economy that goes into building that home. Employment, right. And then the raw materials, the plumbing, the electrical, the this, the that, the lumber, everything that goes into, building a home. Just think how many companies are doing very well because of the home builders.
Right.
So that was a big
great point. The multiplier effect of housing is truly incredible. You're exactly right. It involves so many people, so many businesses, so many jobs. You mentioned, for instance, lumber. I watch all markets. Lumber prices are going crazy lately. That's a good sign also for construction generally. We want lumber prices to rise. But you're right. The multiplier effects of housing are perhaps greater than for any other segment of the economy.
Gotcha. I've got Steve Cortez here, and I want to shift the topic to tariffs. I'm from a small little town in West Virginia. I think I told you that at one time. It was all up and down the river where I grew up. It was steel mills. And it's basically a ghost town at this point. The tariffs, is that what kind of is making China contract? Or is there other pieces of that puzzle that you think that's causing that?
No, listen, I think it's absolutely part of it. Part of why China was slowing, and again, was slowing even before the virus. China was slowing pretty dramatically. And I think one of the main reasons is, yes, Donald Trump finally, and by the way, this is one of the main reasons he was elected. I'm not sure he would have won the election if it weren't for the China issues. Donald Trump decided to finally demand fairness and reciprocity from China as a trading partner, because China has been abusing the United States economically for decades. Yeah. It's unfortunately done so with our complicity, though, at least at the highest level of politics and business in this country. And he said enough. He said, unless there's fairness and reciprocity in our trade relationship, you are going to face consequences via tariffs. And so the Chinese economy has suffered dramatically because of that. Because here's the thing about China, too. The economic model that they built is totally dependent on exports. They have never really developed the kind of internal consumer economy that they need to be a first world country. It's nothing even close, for instance, to the U.S. consumer economy. So what I mean by that is they must export to Europe. They must export to the United States. We made that more difficult, and we made it more troublesome, and I think rightly so, because they weren't being real trade partners with the United States. They were really being trade abusers of the United States, and they caused a lot of havoc in places like West Virginia, like your home state. And so anyway, all of that, I think, was necessary and good, problematic for China, for sure, and look, causes some problems in the United States. It's not consequence-free here either. But again, I think it's a confrontation that we needed to have for decades. And Donald Trump finally stepped up with the smarts and the guts to say, we're going to hold China's feet to the fire.
Well, it's funny, when all this was taking place, the left side of the equation would always come back and say, here we go. It's going to crush the world. Everything's going to come to an end. Nothing's going to come of this. You're starting a war with them. And then, a year later, they're at the bargaining table. So I want to ask you, you live in Illinois. I live in Illinois. Illinois just seems to be I hate to say it, kind of the armpit of the country right now, between our politics, our economics, the taxes, the housing, everything. Obviously, this is the mortgage update, so I'm reliant on housing for my business. Sure. But what's your thought on the economy? And then that does proceed out to the housing market.
Sure, exactly. Yeah, unfortunately, look, and I hate to say this, all right, I'm born and raised in Chicago. I have raised a family in the city of Chicago, which is not always an easy thing to do financially and otherwise. So, I love this place. I love this city. If you cut me, I bleed Chicago Bears blue and orange. Okay. So I'm not I'm not looking for reasons to rip on Chicago or rip on the state of Illinois. However, I have to be honest about the situation. And, we should probably have signs at the roads, as you enter Illinois, particularly this time of year, that say, come for the cold and stay for the taxes and the corruption. Because that's what we offer right now. We offer frigid winters, tons of corruption and confiscatory taxes. And it's really a shame because, I talked about how great the housing market is on a national level. That's fantastic for the country. But you know what? It is not here in Illinois for very obvious reasons. Our property taxes are far too high, first of all. The growth rate is far too low. Too many people are leaving. All the data shows this. And what's really unfortunate is for people who decide to leave Illinois. And look, I don't want to leave. As I said, I've raised a family here. This is my home. I want to stay. But if you do decide you want to leave Illinois, you sell your house that generally has not appreciated, right? When I talk to anybody who's thinking about leaving, they always say the same thing to me, Dan. They say, I'm just hoping to get out without a loss. I mean, that's literally how we've been trained to think in Illinois. That's not the way most of the real estate markets work in America. If you talk to people in Texas and Tennessee and Florida, they're like, I've made 30% of my home the last 3 years, right? So we're selling here hoping to not take a loss, and then we have to pay up wherever it is that we want to move, right? Because those places have appreciated. So it's troubling. Here's the light potentially at the end of the tunnel. The feds are all over Mike Madigan right now. They have surrounded him and his cronies with some very serious investigations. If we can actually put some handcuffs on some really, really senior people and get some indictments, maybe then, Dan, things can change and we can save this terrific city and this terrific state.
I'm trying to get Alan Skilcorn. He's a House representative. He came on about 2 months ago, and he was kind of signaling a little bit about the Madigan. What's happening with Madigan? There was a curveball to me, and then just the other day I heard some more information about him. So we're actually trying to reach out to him right now to get him back on the show to give us his take, because it is shocking on how much power Madigan has. I
tell people outside of Illinois, he is probably one of the least known, most powerful politicians in the United States of America, because he's barely known outside the state of Illinois. He really is. He's very quiet and stealthy, but he's also very diabolical and very powerful. And he rules his state, and he has for decades, and it has been for his benefit and the benefit of his cronies to the detriment of the citizens of Illinois. However, it seems, again, I hope against hope, it seems as though the feds are getting pretty serious about their investigations of at least people in his orbit, if not Madigan himself. And maybe that's what we need, something that dramatic to finally shake free the politics of this state. And again, get our state growing again, growing in people, growing in house prices, growing in every way we should be. Chicago is the greatest city in the world. This is a great state. I want it to be saved. What's been going on here has been really nothing but a complete shame.
Yeah. One last question for you. I know you got to go. The stock market. I do a YouTube video every night, and I give predictions on, what the economy did today and rates in the stock market, and what's, my prediction is the next week, month, so forth. I always say pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. Right. What's your take on the stock market right now?
Yeah, I think the stock market is a little rich here. I mean, rich meaning I think it's a bit excessively priced. I do. No, I don't think it's dramatically overvalued. I'm not calling, to short the market. I'm not saying we're going to crack, none of that. I mean, because I do think the fundamentals are great for this economy, particularly for wages in this country. And I think interest rates are, as I said, if I'm right about interest rates staying low, that's very supportive of equity markets as well. But I think you also have to realize that the U.S. equity market has so massively outperformed the rest of the world. Given that level of outperformance, I don't know that this is a time to get really excited from here. Yeah. We've come a heck of a long way, and again, this is me putting on my market trader hat, not my politics hat. So
that's why I asked. Yeah, and you see the market.
I'm not bearish, but I don't love the prices here either.
Same here.
I'm pretty agnostic right now.
Perfect. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, Steve Cortez. Make sure you tune in every night, 560. Chicago, from 5 to 7 every night. You're going to hear Steve Cortez, and you won't be disappointed. I promise you. Thanks again, Steve. Great having you.
You bet. Thanks, Dan.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Mortgage Update with Dan Frio. For over 30 years, Dan Frio has mastered the real estate market as one of the country's premier mortgage advisors. Call Dan today at 844-775-LOAN. That's 844-775-5626 or online at thefrioteam.com.